Hey, welcome back. My name is Sushant Satish, and I'm your trainer for this AZ-500 Azure Security Engineer Certification course. In this video, we're going to learn about Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. Let's have a high-level look at what are the things we are going to learn on this video. We will start with understanding what is Microsoft Zero Trust Model, what is Microsoft Identity Management and how it evolved, and what are privileged identity management features, scope, and how can you onboard privileged identity management. And we will talk about what are the PIM configuration settings and the workflow. Without wasting any more time, let's get into it. So what is a zero trust model? A zero trust model states that you should never assume trust, but instead continually validate trust. When users, devices, and data all resided inside the organization's firewall, they were assumed to be trusted. This assumed trust allowed for easy lateral movement after a malicious hacker compromised an endpoint device. Instead of assuming everything behind the corporate firewall is safe, the zero trust model assumes breach and verifies each request as though it originates from an open network. Regardless of where the request originates or what resources it accesses, zero trust teaches us to never trust and always verify. Every access request is fully authenticated, authorized, and encrypted before granting access. Microsegmentation and least privileged access principles are applied to minimize lateral movement. Rich intelligence and analytics are utilized to detect and respond to anomalies in real time. With most users now accessing application and data from the internet, most of the components of the transaction, that is the users, network, and devices, are no longer under organizational control. The zero trust model relies on verifiable user and device trust claims to grant access to organizational resources. No longer is the trust assumed based on the location inside an organization's perimeter. This is a quick diagram to show you the basic components of the zero trust model. Notice that there are some components which is determining this trust. So let me take you through these one by one. What is an identity provider? Identity provider establishes a user's identity and related information. And what is device directory? Device directory validates a device and device integrity. The next trust determination is policy evaluation service. This determines whether the user and device conform to use. This determines whether the user and device conform to security policies. And the last trust determination is access policy. Access policy determines which organizational resources can be accessed. So let's learn about how can you implement a zero trust security model. Migrating to a zero trust security model provides for a simultaneously improvement of security over conventional network-based approaches and to better enable users where they need access. A zero trust model requires signals to inform decisions, policies to make access decisions, and enforcement capabilities to implement those decisions effectively. The user is the common denominator of these components. That's why a user identity and how that identity is managed is now called the control plane. If you can't determine who the user is, you can't establish a trust relationship for other transactions. So what are the guiding principles of zero trust model? The first one is how can you verify explicitity? So let's look at the guiding principles of zero trust. The first principle we are going to look is called verify explicitly. Always authenticate and authorize based on all available data points, including user identity, location, device health, service or workload, data classification, and anomalies. The second principle is use the least privileged access. Limit user access with just-in-time and just enough access. Risk-based adaptive policies and data protection to protect both data and productivity. And the third guiding principle is always assume breach. Minimize blast radius for breaches and prevent lateral movement by segmenting access by network, user, devices, and application awareness. Verify all sessions are encrypted end to end. Use analytics to get visibility, drive threat detection, and improve defenses. So now let's have a look at Microsoft Zero Trust architecture. So this example is a simplified reference architecture for our approach to implementing Zero Trust. So this is a simplified reference architecture example from Microsoft to implement the Zero Trust. The primary components of this process are: use Intune for device management and device security policy configuration, use Azure AD conditional access for device health validation, and Azure AD for user and device inventory. The system works with Intune, pushing device configuration requirements to manage devices. The device then generates a statement of health, which is stored in Azure AD, and when the device user requests access to a resource, the device health state is verified as part of the authentication exchange with Azure AD. When the user requests access to a resource, the device health state is verified as part of the authentication exchange with Azure AD. Now let's understand what is Microsoft Identity Management. Microsoft Identity Manager, or MIM, helps organizations manage the users, credentials, policies, and access within their organization and hybrid environments. With MIM, organizations can simplify identity lifecycle management with automated workflows, business rules, and easy integration with heterogeneous platforms across the data center. MIM enables Active Directory to have the right users and access rights for on-premises apps. Azure AD Connect can then make those users and permissions available in Azure AD for Office 365 and cloud-hosted apps. Identity has become the common factor among many services like Microsoft Office 365 and Xbox Live, where the person is the center of the services. Identity is the new security boundary, the new firewall, the new control plane, whichever the comparison you prefer. Your digital identity is the combination of who you are and what you are allowed to do. That is called credentials plus privileges equal to digital identity. So the first step is you need to protect your privileged identities. These identities have more than the normal user's right, and if compromised, allows a malicious hacker to access sensitive corporate assets. Helping secure these privileged identities is a critical step to establishing security assurance for business assets in the modern organization. Cybercriminals target these accounts and other privileged services in their kill chain to carry out their objectives. So before we start with privileged identity management, I would like to talk about evolution of identity as well. Identity management approaches have evolved from traditional to advanced to optimal now. So what is a traditional identity approach? Traditional identity approaches on-premises identity providers, no single sign-on to present between on-premises and cloud apps, and the visibility into identity risk is very limited. So how did identities evolve from traditional to advanced? Let's look at advanced identity approaches. In the advanced approach, cloud identity federates with cloud identity systems. Conditional access policies gate access and provide remediation actions. And we can always use analytics to improve visibility into identity risk. And now let's look into the optimal identity approaches. In the optimal model, you always use passwordless authentication and it is always enabled. And user, location, devices, and behavior are analyzed in real time. And continuous protection to identity risk is always enabled. So what are the steps you can take for a passwordless world? The first recommendation I can provide is you need to always think about enforcing multi-factor authentication. You can use Fast Identity Online, which is FIDO 2.0 standard. So you can require a PIN and a biometric for authentication rather than a password. Windows Hello is one good example, but choose the MFA method that works for your organization. Second step towards a passwordless world is to reduce legacy authentication workflows. So you need to figure out how to place apps that require passwords into separate user access portal and migrate user to modern authentication flow most of the time. At Microsoft, only 10% of their users enter a password on a given day. And the third step for a passwordless world is to remove password completely. You can create consistency across Active Directory and Azure Active Directory to enable administrators to remove passwords from Identity Directory. So that's why I'm going to recommend to check out Azure AD Privileged Identity Management as the service to help protect your privileged account. Alright, so now finally we reached at a point so I can explain what is Privileged Identity Management. With the Azure AD Privileged Identity Management service, you can manage, control, and monitor access to important resources in your organization. This includes access to resources in Azure AD, Azure, and other Microsoft online services like Office 365 and Microsoft Intune. This control does not eliminate the need for users to carry out privileged operation in Azure AD, Azure, Office 365, and other software as a services apps. Organizations can give users just-in-time privileged access to Azure resources and Azure AD. PIM, or Privileged Identity Management, helps mitigate the risk of excessive, unnecessary, or misused access rights. Let's start with just-in-time privileged identity access. Providing just-in-time privileged access to Azure AD and Azure resources, IT administrators can pick on activation period between 0 to 24 hours. They will only receive the privilege for that period of time. After the activation period, admins will have to go through the activation process again. Second key feature is time-bound. Assuming time-bound access to resources by using start and end dates. PIM allows you to set an end time for the role. This is particularly useful in a guest scenario. The third key feature is ability to have approval to activate privileged roles. You can designate one or more approvers. These approvers will receive an email once a request is made. Approval is required to activate the privilege. The fourth key feature is Azure Multi-Factor Authentication, or MFA. If your organization already has MFA enabled, PIM will not ask the user to sign in again. Let's look at the fifth feature, which is about justification. Using justification to understand why users activate. This benefits both internal and external auditors understanding why the role was activated. You can also require a service ticket number from whatever service product you are using. Another feature is getting notifications. Getting notification when a user is assigned a privilege and when that privilege is activated. The next one is about access reviews. Conducting access reviews to know which users have privileged role in the organization and if they still need them. And the last one is downloading an audit history for an internal and external audit. This keeps tracks of all PIM events. Let me first show you how you can find privileged identity management and how you can configure the PIM to work for your requirement. I'm on my Azure portal. Go to the global search box and type in privileged identity management. So let me tell you what are the things you can use privileged identity management for. The first one is you can view which users are assigned privileged roles to manage Azure resources, as well as which users are assigned administrative roles in Azure AD. The second way you can use privileged identity management is to activate just-in-time access. So you can activate on-demand just-in-time access, administrative access to Microsoft online services like Office 365 and Intune, and to Azure resources of subscriptions, resource groups, and individual resources such as virtual machines. The next way you can use PIM is to review a history of administrator activation, including what changes administrators made in Azure resources. You can get alerts about changes in administrative assignments as well. You can get alerts about changes in administrator assignments. And by using that, you can enable require access to activate Azure AD privileged admin roles. Then you will be able to review membership of administrative roles and require users to provide a justification for continued membership as well. Now let's understand privileged identity management scope. First, what is Azure AD roles? These roles are all in Azure Active Directory, such as global administrator, exchange administrator, and security administrator. You can read more about these roles and their functionality in administrative role permissions in Azure Active Directory. The next one is Azure Resource Roles. These roles are linked to an Azure resource group, subscription, or management group. PIM provides just-in-time access to both built-in roles like owner, user access administrator, and contributor, as well as custom roles. Now let's understand how can you onboard PIM. First and foremost, to use privileged identity management, you need one of the following paid or trial licenses, which is Azure AD Premium P2 or Enterprise Mobility Plus Security, which is EMS E5, or Microsoft 365 E5. The first global administrator to use the PIM in your instance of Azure AD is automatically assigned to the security administrator and privileged role administrator roles in the directory. This person must be an eligible Azure AD user. Only privileged role administrators can manage the Azure AD directory role assignment of users. No one else in your Azure Active Directory organization gets write access by default. Other global administrators, security admins, security reader have read-only access to privileged identity management. To grant access to the privileged identity management, the first user can assign others to the privileged role administrator. Please make sure there are always at least 2 users in a privileged role administrative role in case one user is logged out or their account is deleted. So let us look at how we can configure the PIM and what are the settings available to configure privileged identity management. First, let's look at the activation settings. Under activation settings, there are few key things. The first one is activation duration. You can set the maximum time in hours that a role always stays before it expires. This value can be from 1 to 24 hours. The second option is require multi-factor authentication on activation. You can require users who are eligible for a role to prove who they are using Azure multi-factor authentication before they can activate. Multi-factor authentication ensures that the user is who they say they are with reasonable certainty. Enforcing this option protects critical resources in situations when the user account might have been compromised. The next option is for the user to require a justification. You can request that user enter a business justification when they activate. And the last option is require approval to activate. If setting multiple approvers, approval completes as soon as one of them approves or denies. You can't require approval from at least 2 users. Let's look at the next settings, which is all about assignment. Under assignment, there are 2 important settings. The first one is allow permanent eligible assignment. Global admins and privileged role admins can enter permanent eligible assignment. They can also require that all eligible assignments have a specified start and end date. The second important setting is allow permanent active assignment. These settings allow global admins and privileged role admins will be able to assign active enable assignment. They can also require that all active assignments have a specified start and end date. In some cases, you might want to assign a user to a role for a short duration, probably for 1 day, for example. In this case, the assigned users don't need to request activation. In this scenario, privileged identity management can't enforce multi-factor authentication when the user uses their role assignment because they are already active in the role from the time that it is assigned. And the last settings we need to be aware about is about notification settings. Notification can be sent when members are assigned as eligible in a role, assigned as active in a role, and when the role is activated. And notification can be sent to admins, requesters, and approvers. Now let's have a look at how PIM's elevated workflow look like. By configuring Azure AD PIM to manage our elevated access roles in Azure AD, We now have just-in-time access for more than 28 configurable privileged roles. We can also monitor access, audit account elevations, and receive additional alerts through a management dashboard in Azure portal. Elevated access include job roles that needed greater access, including support, resource administrators, resource owners, service administrators, and global administrators. We manage role-based access at the resource level. Because elevated access accounts could be misused if they are compromised, we rationalize new requests for elevated access and perform regular re-attestation for elevated roles. This is an example diagram which shows the elevated access workflow. Now let's have a look at how just-in-time administrative access looks like. Azure AD PIM introduced the concept of permanent and eligible administrators in Azure AD and Azure. Permanent administrators have persistent elevated role connections, whereas eligible administrators have privileged access only when they need it. The eligible administrative role is inactive until the employee needs access. Then they complete an activation process and become an active administrator for a set amount of time. Now let's understand role activation in Azure Active Directory. To activate a role, an eligible admin will initialize Azure AD PIM in the Azure portal and request a time-limited role activation. The activation is requested using the Active My Role option in Azure AD PIM. Users requesting activation must satisfy conditional access policies to ensure that they are coming from authorized devices and location, and their identities must be verified through a multi-factor authentication as well. And how can you track the use of privileged identity roles using a dashboard? Azure provides a centralized reporting dashboard where you can go and look at alerts that points out opportunities to improve security. Then you can get a report where you can find the number of users who are assigned to each privileged role, and you would be able to find the number of eligible permanent admins as well. And then there is a report which gives you reports on ongoing access reviews as well. So that concludes the episode 5, which was all about Microsoft Zero Trust model and Azure Privileged Identity Management. In the next video, we're going to learn about hybrid identity and how can you secure hybrid identity. So we'll see you on the next one. Till then, take care.